All right. Hello, everybody. We are here again with more Modern Magic Online. Not tokens this time. We are going to be testing out Esper Death Shadow. I've been playing just a handful of leagues with this deck and tinkering around with it. Been looking up various Esper builds that I found online and kind of messed with and what I think was appropriate for the current metagame, as well as just my experience playing deaths like this. I have a little experience playing Grixis Death Shadow, but obviously primarily played more mid-range decks, John and Abzan, and of course, as most of you who follow the channel know, just Black-White Tokens. It's the deck I play the most in Modern. But I have played other mid-range decks, and so though I'm new to this one, I've been casting a lot of Thoughtseizes and Path to Exiles and Grimad Anglers before. What's new is Stubborn Denial, which I think is kind of one of the main reasons that this deck is so viable. Just having a 1-mana negate's just super powerful right now. Obviously, in addition to having 1-mana 5/5s and 1-mana 9/9s and whatnot. So anyway, let's get to the build and then we'll get to some games. Pretty standard from a lot of Death Shadow decks. 6 discard spells, 4 and 2 seems to be pretty common breakdown. A lot of Death Shadow decks, and then I have 11 of the cantrips here, shaved and op. Obviously, keeping the Thought Scours, mostly for anglers and of course Lingering Souls. And just decided to trim on the opt, and I think any less than 4 street wraiths has to be wrong in this deck. Then no baubles, obviously, because we don't have any reason for delirium, and we're not that hyper aggressive. We're a little bit more on the mid range side than like a Grixis Death Shadow, so a little bit slower of a deck and a little more resilient and mostly better answers. I probably should start with that. I think one of the reasons why I think Esper could be potentially very good right now is for the answers that white provides you, such as Path to Exile. Lingering Souls obviously is, creatures that you attack with, and sometimes it's very relevant, but I do find it to be very good as an answer card, as just like chump blockers against certain decks. And then obviously things like Stony Silence are very good in modern metagame in general, not necessarily right now. It has been for a long time. So anyway, here are the cantrips. I'm going with 3 Stubborn Denial with the 4th one on the sideboard. I do believe and have read a lot, just 4 in the 75 is correct. Many people, especially Grixis, plays 4 main deck. I just feel like there are still matchups where it's not something you want. For humans, for example, that I wanted to not be quite so narrow in the main deck. 3 Fatal Pushes only because I'm running 2 Path to Exiles as well, so that's 5 1-mana removal spells already. And then an Orzhov Charm, which is another great card for this deck. Obviously, it's just it's a murder, kills anything at instant speed, and you actually get in this deck, upside of losing life equal to that creature's toughness. So again, fills that dismember spot where you get to lose life and kill something, but a little bit more versatile, as it is in non-creature matchups. It's not dead, as you can return a Death Shadow to the battlefield. So that's either one that was killed or one that you've flipped over with Thought Scour. So I think the card is really good. I would consider playing 2. I had a 1 in the sideboard for grinding your matchups, but as good and as versatile as the card is, it just can be kind of unexciting. So as much as I like it a lot, I feel like trimming it just down to 1 is probably better. And then 1 of Anguish Unmaking, which again is something nice that you can play in this deck. Having access to having ways to exile things is very relevant in a world of Phoenixes and Dredge and things like that. So Path to Exile fills that role, and Anguish Unmaking is good. And I always just like having a very versatile answer. I'd say the most versatile answer you can have to planeswalkers or problematic artifacts in game 1, or anything like that, or enchantments, which are things that you have trouble dealing with in Grixis. And again, in this deck, having the advantage of losing 3 life along with it can be pretty relevant. Obviously, we've got 4 Death Shadows, going 3 Gurmag Anglers. Again, mostly because I have, instead of 4 or adding a 4th in a Tasker, the Lingering Souls are kind of adding the extra creature spot. So I felt like I could get away with just 3 Anglers. Then another, again, we've talked about it, but Lingering Souls being a very good threat and defensive answer in this deck, and something that white gives you. Liliana the Last Hope. I do like running Lilianas in Death Shadow in general. I do think it's a very powerful card. It costs 3, which means it's your top end, but I think you got to be okay with that. Have a Lily of the Veil in the sideboard. I was doing the Veil in the main deck for a while and Last Hope in the sideboard, but I feel like having the -2 and the inevitability of plussing with this one is a little more relevant. I think in general, I have found, at least in playing the deck, that more likely than not, I'm wanting to -2 to put a threat back in my hand more than I'm trying to -2 to kill something. So that's where I figured this would be the better main deck card. So I have it here. Snapcaster Mage, only 2. Just couldn't quite find room for the 3rd one. There's just already a lot of things that I'm running 1-ofs and less ofs than I would want to. So sticking with 2, 3 could certainly be correct, but given it's a 3-drop, I'm already running Lingering Souls and Liliana. I didn't want to run too many 3-drops here. And then Search for Escanta. I've actually seen more decks playing this. I thought I was unique, but I've actually been looking at more lists, and a lot of people are running Search for Escanta, or actually what's more popular now is Jace Vryn's Prodigy, Baby Jace, in this slot. But I have liked it just as a way of grinding having this deck some longer game versatility, which is something that in Grixis you get Kolaghan's Command that just really gives a really grindy component to the deck, as you can do a lot with that and a lot of card advantage with that. So I think Search for Escanta is kind of a long game card advantage. Also just filters, right? It's great with our graveyard synergy, and tries to help us find the cards that we need. If it's a threat or an answer, it'll help dig us to that, much like Opt and Thoughtscour will. And then obviously the biggest thing you lose with not running red in this deck is Temur Battle Rage. And that's the biggest argument for running red in Grixis decks, and in many Grixis decks that's the only red card in the main deck, not even Kolaghan's Command. So kind of to supplant that a little bit, Distortion Strike is probably the best thing you can do in these colors to kind of give you that big hit, for 9, 10, 11, 12, even 13 with a Death Shadow. If you just need to get that last hit in. The fact that it rebounds is nice, as you can, set it up over 2 turns. Of course, obviously you need to survive the second turn, that you don't kill them. You need to be able to survive on the backswing from your opponent, if that matters. But if it is, then even a Gurmag Angler is attacking for 12 over 2 turns, which should be enough to win you the game at that point by the time you're doing it. And if it didn't, then a Battle Rage certainly wasn't going to do it with an Angler. Testing this out, it was a sideboard card for me at first, and I put one in the main deck just because I felt like it's just very necessary, and it's the Temur Battle Rage of the deck. As far as lands go, I am running 18, not 17. Again, we have a little bit more of the 3-drops than usual, and also things like Search for Escanta that I'd like to be activating if we flip it. So I'm going with 18 lands, one of each basic. Even though we don't have a lot of white cards, we do still have more than the red cards in the Grixis version. We have 1, 2, 3, 5, 6 in the main deck, and another 6 in the sideboard. So I do want to make sure I have a Plains and a lot of Field of Ruins going on and things like that. So I wanted to have access to these basics to 2 Watery Graves and 1 of the other shocks. So 1 Godless Shine, 1 Hollow Fountain, and 2 Watery Graves is pretty standard as far as these shadow decks go. And then I'm actually doing 2 Dark Slick Shores and only 9 fetch lands instead of the 11 fetch lands, which would be more common. Or 10 for the decks that run 17 lands. Just like having some access to pain-free mana if we can find it. Sideboard. This is where things are all over the place. This is just shows my lack of experience with the deck in building a different sideboard. And obviously, while my main deck is based off of a lot of the Grixis builds and what they've been doing and just making some modifications, the sideboard changes drastically as white gives us some really powerful sideboard options. And so I was trying to mess around and see where we're going, but definitely wanted another Path to Exile against big creature decks and things where Fatal Push isn't great. Being on a path, things like Wormcoil Engines and Titans is things that Grixis doesn't quite have access to, so that's something that really makes this deck tick a little bit better. Stony Sands is great. The only reason I'm not running 3 like I do in most mid-range decks, white mid-range decks, is that this deck just cycles through its cards so quickly. So kind of running 2 in this deck is pretty close mathematically to running 3 in another deck. Same thing goes with Surgical Extraction. I usually like to run 3, but in this deck I think running 2 with all the cantrips we have and all the fetch lands we have, I think makes that about equivalent. No Rest in Peace, obviously, because we need our graveyard as much. So Surgical is the graveyard hate of choice, as well as 1 Nihil Spellbomb, which again is one-sided, so it doesn't affect our graveyard negatively. Disenchant as well. I'm not sure how much this card is needed, but we're playing white. It's just nice to have a clean actual answer to cards, to Ensnaring Bridges and problematic enchantments potentially. Obviously, we have the Anguished Unmaken in the main deck, which deals with those, but I wanted to have another one, and being instant speed is really nice in a deck like this. Then obviously another Lingering Souls. I had 3 in the main deck for a while, but I trimmed it down to 2 and put 1 in the sideboard. I think it's plenty. I think you're going to find them. You don't usually need more than 1. You're often casting them from the graveyard, so if you can cast 2 from the graveyard, that's great as well. But this, again, a card you can certainly search for, because your Thought Scour is actually dig you 4 cards deep to find it. 3 cards deep to find it. So that helps a lot. Added obviously 4th Stubborn Denial in the sideboard. Not sure why this art's not coming up, but the 2nd Distortion Strike against decks that would have a lot of chump blockers and that we just need to be able to kill them quickly for. Ceremonious Rejection, obviously Hardened Scales is a big one too. Lantern and War Decks is huge, and then Tron's the big one that this card adds a lot between the Stubborn Denials and Ceremonious Rejections for their Wormcoil Engines and Ulamogs and things that you can't Stubborn Denial. This card is phenomenal, albeit narrow, and it's just really good. Adding to that, running 1 Counter Squall, just yet another counter spell. I was trying Mana Leak for a while, just to be able to counter creatures as they come down, but I feel like we just have enough removal to do that. And the creatures that we care about we can deal with Path to Exile. And again, Wormcoil Engine has been a problem in previous testing, but Ceremonious Rejection gets that. And obviously it's just a negate, and we are in, to a degree, we're an aggressive deck, and so the paying an extra black mana on your negate to deal 2 life is certainly worth it. Talked about Liliana the Veil, just a good mid-range option, good option against control decks and combo decks and things like that. Be able to land a threat that's harder for them to deal with than your Shadows and Anglers. And then Zealous Persecution. Again, Distortion Strike deals with a lot of the smaller go-wide creature decks, but on the offensive side only. So this is kind of a cool bet that white gives you. Great with your own Lingering Souls, great against Lingering Souls, great against things like Affinity and Elves and Goblins if you happen to see that. Even Spirits is really, really good against. And this is a deck that doesn't really want to run real sweepers like Wrath of God and Damnations. One, because we're trying to have creatures on the battlefield, but two, just because it costs 4 mana, for the same reason that I don't think Settle the Wreckage is quite what this deck is looking for, even though we're running white. So that's the deck and the sideboard. Very curious to see what you guys think. Those of you coming in as more experienced Death Shadow players, I'm curious to hear your opinions. I know some people just don't think the Esper decks or builds are viable, but I do think there's something to be had here, and if not, it's just further testing. On the London Mulligan rule, I do think that's an area where this deck, obviously, I've talked about this in previous Black-White Tokens videos, but people don't think of the mid-range decks as ones that benefit from that rule. Just the combo decks benefit more, but everyone benefits. Obviously, the rule makes every deck a little bit better. And as a mid-range deck, really it makes you find your answers better, right? And a deck like this, where you really just want to be able to, get a Death Shadow and back it up with Stubborn Denial, I think you don't need a ton of cards to do that. And when you are playing against decks where you need certain answers like Stony Silences and more counterspells or surgical extractions, if you're mulliganing to a more reactive hand, it gives you 7 looks at reactive cards, and you really don't need the volume if you can Thoughtseize away some card and take them surgical extraction out of their deck, then that buys you a lot. You can mulligan to 4 or 5 and take a Titan out of an Amulet deck and do very well for yourself. Slow them down enough that you'll eventually make up for the fact that you've mulliganed down to 5 or so. Not that you want to do that, obviously. Overall, like, mid-range decks require more volume of cards than others, but it is something where adding white with better sideboard options, you are able to dig towards your sideboard cards much better with the mulligan rule. And just, again, being a deck that has a lot of cantrips, I think it's if you're looking to be a little bit more reactive in Modern, which most people are not, I think adding white in this deck rather than red has some merit to it. Is it better? Probably not. I think there are thousands of people playing Death Shadow all the time, and most people have settled on Grixis, but these, I always like testing things a little bit on the fridge to see how they're doing and see where they can be improved. So thank you everybody for watching, and hope you enjoy the